president has announced an agreement with Mexico following days of growing pressure from congressional Republicans, major corporations, and state governments to not impose tariffs on Mexican imports to the United States. It seems like their collective prayers have been answered. The president tweeted about 90 minutes ago, quote, "The tariffs scheduled to be implemented by the United States on Monday against Mexico are hereby indefinitely suspended. Mexico, in turn, has agreed to take strong measures to stem the tide of migration through Mexico and to our southern border. This is being done to greatly reduce or eliminate illegal immigration coming from Mexico and into the United States." Well, tonight, the State Department released the broad outlines of the agreement, including that, quote, "Mexico will take unprecedented steps to increase enforcement to curb irregular migration, to include the deployment of its National Guard throughout Mexico, giving priority to its southern border. And, quote, "Those crossing the U.S. southern border to seek asylum will be rapidly returned to Mexico, where they may await the adjudication of their asylum claims. In response, Mexico will authorize the entrance of all those individuals for humanitarian reasons in compliance with its international obligations while they await the adjudication of their asylum claims." State Department officials were with the delegation from Mexico for 12 hours today working out this agreement. Now, you'd be forgiven for thinking the president was solely focused on these negotiations today before the Monday deadline when the tariffs would have gone into effect. But it seemed his mind was elsewhere. After all, who can focus on tariffs when House Speaker Nancy Pelosi is getting under your skin? The president was ranting again for the second day in a row about Speaker Pelosi, after she reportedly said in a private meeting that she would rather see Trump in prison for his alleged crimes than see him impeached. During his trip home from Europe today, the president used a series of pejoratives to describe Nancy Pelosi that we will not repeat here. That followed this remark on Fox, which he made in front of a U.S. military cemetery in Normandy, France.
She's a nasty, vindictive, horrible person. The Mueller report came out. It was a disaster for them. They thought their good friend Bobby Mueller was going to give them a great report, and he came out with a report with 13 horrible, angry Democrats who were totally biased against me. Nancy Pelosi, I call her Nervous Nancy. Nancy Pelosi doesn't talk about it. Nancy Pelosi's a disaster, okay? She's a disaster. And let her do what she wants. You know what? I think they're in big trouble.
All right, the president seems to have a short memory when it comes to talk of jailing opponents after his years of leading lock her up chants. And he's not the only one with memory problems.
Speaker Pelosi now apparently telling senior Democrats she'd like to see Trump behind bars. Based on no actual crime, she wants a political opponent locked up in prison. That happens in banana republics. Beyond despicable behavior.
Now, it's not clear what triggered Trump's Pelosi tweets, possibly just general outrage, but he seemed to be watching Fox Business on his trip home as he sent some tweets about the moon and NASA just minutes after the network discussed those very topics. Those were the topics: the moon and Nancy Pelosi, that Trump was apparently focused on as Air Force One headed back to Washington, D.C. We can't say for certain how involved the president was in these negotiations, but his Twitter feed might give you a bit of an idea. However, I do know somebody who was involved in this because I've been watching her emails about it all day. Joining us by phone is NBC News White House correspondent Kristen Welker, who has been following the discussions. Kristen, we now have some details about what Mexico agreed to in order to get these tariffs not to be imposed on Monday. It was a long and involved meeting for a second day.
Ali, it was long, it was involved. You talked about the 12 hours of negotiations today. Remember that capped 3 straight days of negotiations between U.S. and Mexican negotiators. So this has been an intensive process. In terms of how involved the president's been, I've been told that they have been updating him frequently. And then once he stepped off of Air Force One, by the way, I tried to shout some questions to him today to see if, in fact, there was a deal. I was told that he was presented with the final outlines of this deal that ultimately seems to have come together. So you talked about some of it, these sticking points that they've worked through. The biggest one, I would say, Allie, the breaking point, I would say, likely the fact that Mexico has agreed to hold asylum seekers in Mexico. That's a big one. It's going to require more resources on the part of Mexico, more detention centers. But look, they've also agreed to boost intelligence sharing. They're going to deploy 6,000 National Guard troops. So they have come to the table in ways that the United States was really pushing them to do. The politics of this also significant, Allie. Of course, the president was getting a lot of pressure from members of his own party who said, bottom line, if these tariffs go into effect on Monday at 5% and then start to increase over time, ultimately, that is going to hurt American consumers. So tonight, this is a victory for not only the president, but for the Mexicans as well. But it may be a temporary one. They're going to keep talking, and they're going to reevaluate this in 90 days, Allie.
Let me ask, so there's two elements of this, as you said, the things that the Mexicans are going to do at the U.S. border, including taking asylum seekers from the United States and having them wait while their hearing's underway. That's a fairly big departure. I don't even understand the legality of it, but it's a big departure from the way things work now. And then there's the other element in which Mexico is going to be deploying members of its National Guard, including to its southern border, where a lot of these migrants enter Mexico.
That's right, and I think that's an important distinction. This is going to be, I'm told, the Guatemala region, and they're essentially going to be trying to head off the migrants there to try to essentially control the flow so that you aren't seeing these huge swells make their way to the United States. If you speak to officials, they say that the numbers have been staggering. They have used these figures to really try to turn up the pressure on Mexico. But according to CBP, 140,000 migrants, if not more, crossed the border last month alone. And, Allie, that was a 13-year high. So that's why there was so much concern, according to the White House. That's why they were making the case that this was a real crisis and why President Trump was really moving to try to do something. But again, and I can't stress this enough, he was getting a lot of pressure from his own party, essentially saying, look, we might move to pass legislation to block you. That would have been a huge rebuke to this Republican president. So he was under pressure himself, Allie, to try to get this deal. And what the U.S. negotiators were saying is, look, it's fantastic that Mexico is offering to send those 6,000 National Guard troops to the border with Guatemala, but we need more. And they finally got it tonight in the form of Mexico agreeing to hold asylum seekers. That is a big give on the part of the Mexican government.
Kristen, I appreciate your reporting on this. Thank you for joining us tonight. Kristen Welker,
Absolutely, Allie. Thank you
White
for
House
having
correspondent.
me.
Thank you. In Washington. All right, NBC News White House correspondent Kristen Welker. Joining me now, Rick Wilson, Republican strategist and contributor to the Daily Beast. He's the author of the book, Everything Trump Touches Dies. Jennifer Rubin, opinion writer at the Washington Post and an MSNBC contributor. And Brian Klaas, columnist for the Washington Post and the author of The Despot's Apprentice, Donald Trump's Attack on Democracy. Thanks to the three of you for joining us. Rick, Kristen made the point right at the end that the president gets Republican support on being tough on immigration and at the border. He gets a little less support on the tariffs on China. But there was really a shot across the bow earlier this week, including by Mitch McConnell, who said, don't do this. Don't do this Mexico thing without talking to us first.
Well, that's because Mitch McConnell realizes that tariffs are always an economic disaster. They're always a tax on Americans, and they always hurt American consumers. He also realizes that there are 3 economists in the whole country who believe that the same thing Donald Trump believes about tariffs, and they all work for him, and they're all morons. And so there was a very clear signal from McConnell and a very clear signal from other members of the Senate that this was a line they weren't going to cross. They weren't going to deliberately tank the economy because Donald Trump believes in some esoteric 19th or 17th century trade model that doesn't exist. And that is nothing but an economic disaster. And by the way, I don't think I want to see the actual paper before we say the president achieved anything yet. This is a man who is very, very famous for making some very broad claims about his success in negotiations. And when the rubber hits the road, there's a whole lot less there than usually appears.
Well, this is an interesting point. And like Kristen said, they're going to evaluate this in 90 days. But on paper, I've got the State Department's wording in front of me. Jennifer, first of all, I mean, let's acknowledge it was a self-imposed crisis because the president, there was no issue with tariffs on Mexico. And then it was a self-imposed deadline of Monday. And as Kristen said, the president had to meet that deadline because he understood he wasn't going to get support from his Republican colleagues. That said, if what is on this paper that I've got, that the State Department has put out, in that Mexico is going to hold asylum seekers in Mexico and they're going to deploy troops to their southern border in Guatemala, the president can start to translate that into something that people are going to say he's...
No, he can't. No, he can't. Those are both nonsense things, and I would encourage the press to really look at these things. Under U.S. law, asylum seekers cannot be held in a foreign country. We have an obligation to hold them here. And in fact, it's already been adjudicated in complaints about this when the president tried to roll this out once before. So that is just nonsense. In terms of the National Guard, this is an outfit that's just been set up. And they're not even sure that they have these people, let alone that they can deploy them to the border. So this is nonsense. And I really have to urge the press, we cannot take anything he says at face value. This is all kabuki dance, and we should absolutely pierce through this veil, see what we actually have gotten, see what's actually legal, and I think this is all nonsense.
I want to read to you from this thing because what you said, this is what I was saying to Kristen. I don't understand the legality of sending asylum seekers back. The wording from the State Department, Brian, in response, Mexico will authorize the entrance of all those individuals for humanitarian reasons in compliance with its international obligations while they await the adjudication of their asylum claims. I've been sort of understanding immigration for years as the international obligation is on the country to which someone makes the asylum claim.
It's claiming asylum.
Yes, that's traditionally correct. And I think this is something where we also have to think about the humanitarian implications of this, because we already have a problem dealing with these migrants on our side. So Mexico, which has limited capacity compared to the United States, might have even worse humanitarian responses here. And beyond that, I also think that generally speaking, Trump's foreign policy and his quote-unquote deal-making has involved him acting as both the arsonist and the firefighter. And this is what I think we're seeing right now, is that he's created this crisis, manufactured the crisis, and now is claiming victory for the status quo with some modest changes. And so I think the question is, what will the long-term damage be of creating this sort of tariff war? And that damage might significantly outweigh any of the small concessions that we see, even if they do pass the muster of questionable legality.
Because sometimes the firefighter can't put out the fire that they set. And with the international tariff war, with investment banks saying that the likelihood of a recession has been increased as a result of this thing, you know, the president likes to talk up the economy. He could actually set a fire that he can't put out.
Look, I think that he's been playing this game of chicken on tariffs with Mexico, with China, now with Australia. And in every single case, he has this political utility in his mind that he wants to demagogue some angle of it. And the reason I think that the entire thing with Mexico is a fraud, and as Jennifer correctly pointed out, there is no National Guard there. The reason this whole thing got pulled back was that the economic numbers were much softer than anticipated because he's been doing this for several months. The revision of the prior month's economic numbers was a bit more significant than folks expected. And so I think he's sniffing the wind and knows that if the economy softens and if there's not a big, river of QE coming from the Fed, he's in some political trouble based off of that. And I think that this is a guy who understood that his bluff had been called.
Thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on the button below for more from The Last Word and the rest of MSNBC.